Welcome back to the DYK podcast discussion series. We are pleased to have with us today Dr. Billy Hawkins, who is a professor at the University of Houston in the Department of Health and Human Performance. Dr. Hawkins has written and lectured extensively on the intersection of race and college sports. He is the author of the widely cited book, The New Plantation: Black Athletes, College Sports, and Predominantly White NCAA Institutions. He's also the co-author of Sport, Race, Activism, and Social Change: The Impact of Dr. Harry Edwards' Scholarship and Service. Dr. Hawkins received his PhD from the University of Iowa in Sport and Cultural Studies. He also received a Master's of Science degree in Human Performance from the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse, and a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Weber International University. In our discussion, which was conducted on February 23rd of 2023, Dr. Hawkins shares his thoughts on the racialization of the college sports business model, the connection between athletes' rights and civil rights, and the challenges that African American athletes face in organizing their voices to advocate for their unique interests. Dr. Hawkins, welcome to the DYK Media Podcast.
Thank you.
I've really been looking forward to this discussion. And your scholarship spans over 3 decades, and you have written extensively and powerfully on the intersection of race, college sports, in the context of civil rights. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of your seminal work in the episode, but I want to use as a launch pad an op-ed article that you wrote on February 15th, just last month, in Sportico, titled "How College Athletics Desegregation Impacts the NCAA Today." And you give really a mini history lesson. Could you talk a little bit about what led you to write that article, how you contextualize it, and how you see the themes that you identified as relevant in 2023?
Yeah. One of the things I think is important is that a lot of times we forget, especially when we think about, some of the predominant athletic conferences, we forget that those conferences was predominantly segregated or mainly segregated, especially in the South. There were some in the North that were a little bit more progressive, and when you think about, college football today and even college basketball, when you think about the success of University of Alabama, those schools were predominantly segregated. So one of the things I wanted to do is to highlight the idea that, we're not that far from this form, this whole process of desegregation. And the fact that, we have individuals or had individuals in our history like George Wallace, Bull Connor, Jim Clark, that were staunch segregationists that wanted, those schools to stay segregated. They wanted blacks to attend HBCUs and they wanted whites to attend what we consider the predominantly white or historically white institution. So I wanted to, sort of put in the context that even though we're talking, a little bit over 50 years ago, now we're at a point where, we have individuals like John Calipari that's, have a predominantly black team. We have Nick Saban. You have all these different schools that are, generating millions and millions of dollars, multi-million dollar industry that not too long ago was considered the cradle of white supremacy or the Confederacy, right? So I wanted to sort of remind people, this is the history that we see, these Southern schools having, that we, again, sometimes forget.
Right. It's interesting, and you framed that in the context of Black History Month, and it was, tied to that theme. And I think in some ways, the way that we think about the history of civil rights, the race relations, we do it in a way where it's okay to talk about it for a month and then we put it away.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And what I loved about your article really said, look, this wasn't that long ago. And, maybe to a current college athlete, it does seem long ago.
Yeah.
But really in the post-civil rights era, these issues are still alive. I think that one of the things you tapped into is that the context may have changed outside of a formal civil rights movement, but the issues still exist. And I think that's one of the challenges in the athletes' rights movement is to try to, tie this back into something bigger than college sports. And sometimes these things come up issue by issue today, and then they go away, and we forget that they are still telling the story of the civil rights movement. You looked back at two examples that are commonly cited as kind of milestone moments in the evolution of civil rights in college sports. One was the Texas Western National Championship in 1966 against an all-white Adolph Rupp Kentucky team. And Texas Western was the first NCAA school to start 5 Black athletes in a national championship game. But 4 years later, in 1970, we had another milestone moment where the University of Southern California traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, and played an Alabama team coached by Bear Bryant, an all-white team, and pretty much kicked their butt, And then all of a sudden, the light bulb goes off for Coach Bryant, and then he starts recruiting the athletes that his institution and his state had prohibited from even participating in higher education. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of those milestones?
Yeah, I often label, and other scholars label them as just as important as some of the sit-ins that a lot of the civil rights protesters were doing, civil rights leaders were doing. They was just as, critical to the movement in terms of, sort of deconstructing or destroying some of the legal segregation that took place. And again, they were, because how sport were beginning to be situated in our life during that time, I think, again, the visibility of those programs and the visibility of those games were critical in highlighting the significance. And now we're at a point where, not only did they sort of were the prerequisites of, sort of desegregating these athletic departments. Now they've created a dependency upon the Black body and for these, especially in the SEC, so for not only, allowing Black student athletes, Black collegiate athletes, but also Black students. Okay. I think they also contributed to that movement as well.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is implied in what you talked about was that in these movements in college sports that appear to be consistent with the virtues and the high aspirations of the civil rights movement, there's an interest convergence, right? So, Bear Bryant starts recruiting African-American football players because it enhances his competitive advantage, right? But the underlying policies of the institutions that he represents are still not really moving forward with both feet in civil rights. And you have this interest convergence. Do you see that same dynamic through the civil rights movement? And do you think there's an element of that today?
Definitely, in terms of, because again, I think when you look at the white power structure, they are comfortable in the utility of the Black body, right? And not necessarily, comfortable in talking about, giving them access to power, access to, positions of authority. So yes, it's a major feat. It's a, tremendous feat to allow Black athletes to compete at these institutions that was once, extremely segregated. But when we talk about the fact that, the movement into positions as coaches, athletic directors, presidents, provosts, so there has been a tremendous amount of hesitancy and resistance when you talk about Blacks moving into those, positions of power and authority. So yes, there's this interest convergence that's take place, but it's at a level that is comfortable, right, to the white power structure.
That's so important, that comfort level. Kind of want to use that to segue into your 2010 book, The New Plantation, Black Athletes, College Sports, and Predominantly White NCAA Institutions. I see that book cited again and again as foundational to understanding the current business model. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to write that book, kind of the core themes, and then how you see those themes today in 2023?
Yeah, I was working at a predominantly white institution doing my graduate work, and even as a former athlete in a predominantly white setting, very small school, I noticed patterns, and I began to, wanted to sort of engage these patterns of behavior of how athletes, Black athletes specifically, were treated. I was at a small school in Florida where the main, if not the predominant students on campus were athletes, Black athletes. So, so I went on to different, universities, and I saw, a similar pattern where when you talk about the student body, the makeup of the student body, Black athletes made up the student body. So, I've heard of different individuals talk about sort of this plantation analogy, and I just wanted to put components together of what the plantation consists of, and, sort of draw an analogy to that. And I know when you think about the plantation system, you're generally thinking about, a lot of times we think about the brutality of it, which we should, right? That's significant. But I think there's also a network that's in place, which I began to look at when I was at at one predominantly white institution where you talk about, the apolitical body of the Black athlete. They don't have a say in what they're saying, the athletes in general.
Right.
When you talk about the social and cultural annihilation that exists, because a lot of times I was at an institution in the Midwest where the Black athletes were sort of migrated from, Houston, Miami, and LA to this, Midwestern city, predominantly white. So when you talk about social and cultural annihilation, all of that existed. So I tried to sort of put together, this whole network of components to sort of explain some of the challenges that a lot of Black athletes have in assimilating and acculturating to this environment of predominantly white institutions, and definitely highlighting the wealth transfer, which is a big part when you think about the $1 trillion industry of slavery that took place in this country. And now we have a multi-billion-dollar industry. And some of the similar things that are still taking place, a lot of student athletes, collegiate athletes are experiencing, especially when you talk about Black collegiate athletes, are experiencing racism on campus. They are experiencing social isolation, cultural annihilation. So some of the same practices are still in place, even though they're, praised on Sunday or Saturday or during the week when they're competing. There is a lot of isolation and alienation. Some of it is self-alienation, okay? And obviously there is the economic exploitation. And they still don't necessarily have a political voice, when you talk about on the college campus.
And that's so important, the absence of the athlete voice. And that's true, I think, across the athlete landscape. I think it's particularly true for African American athletes in football and men's basketball whose labors underwrite this entire business model. There have been 7 hearings in Congress since February of 2020, 6 in the Senate, 1 in the House on, athletes' rights or nil compensation and all that stuff. Not a single revenue producing athlete from a Power 5 football or men's basketball program has testified or been called to testify. And in my judgment, that's not coincidental, because these hearings have been staged by the best lobbyists in Washington, D.C. that work for the NCAA and the Power 5. And on the athlete voice, how important is that in terms of civil rights advocacy and the relationship between the institutions and the profit athletes?
Yeah, I think it's tremendous, especially in terms of, obviously Black athletes need to recognize they have a political voice and power. All right. I think it's strategic that it's fragmented and disorganized now. You have coaches, multi-million-dollar coaches that are extremely savvy and, sort of providing concessions to keep them sort of fragmented and disoriented when you talk about their political power. If you think about the college football playoff, $400 million that it generates, and you think about over 70% of the athletes are African American, right? You think about the NCAA tournament, March Madness, that we're getting ready to experience, that generated over 800 million, right? And over 70% of the athletes are African Americans that compete in the Final Four specifically. That's a tremendous amount of latent power, right? And it just takes a matter of time for those athletes to recognize and understand that latent power, organize it, and then, begin to think in terms of how they can form a political voice or political bloc to address some of the challenges they face. Because Richard, similar as you said, I think it's amazing that, there are individuals that think they can be utilitarian in distribution, but capitalist in accumulation,
Yeah,
or
no.
egalitarian in distribution. Where does that happen? No place else, right?
So would it be fair to say that the themes that you identified and led to your 2010 book are as relevant today as they were then? Or do you think things have changed for the better for athletes?
Yeah, I think there have been changes. I think, the recent legislation, state legislation, name, image, and likeness legislation has, pushed the needle. I think the transfer portal, I think there have been forms of what I consider forms of emancipation, economic emancipation when you
Right.
talk about the name, image, and likeness, and definitely mobility emancipation when you talk about the transfer portal. So I think there have been some changes in terms of, athletes being able to, capitalize or monetize their name, image, and likeness. I think there's some, in terms of attention that have been drawn and to allow them to do internships during the summer. There are
Mhm.
other, changes that have taken place to, sort of increase, this sort of emancipation or increase their chances of having what I consider a quality education experience. Now,
Right.
I don't think that's always across the board when you think
Right.
about, football and basketball, right? But I do think as a whole, college athletics have evolved.
Yeah, it raised two really important points there. Do you think that those changes are nibbling around the edges, or are they really going to core issues like, equality of representation, the athlete voice, health and safety, revenue
Mm.
sharing, employee status? I mean, do you see those as those things we have now, this nil market, this kind of
Mhm.
unintentional nil market? I've argued that it isn't because of the NCAA; it's in spite of the NCAA. But
Right, right.
and the transfer market, there's been pressure on that for decades. I've been
Mhm.
talking about this issue for decades. And
Right.
the NCAA's response is, well, the sky's going to fall. This will be the end of college sports. We're going to see the fatal collapse of college sports. And one of the beauties of those two new elements of the business model and the operation of some free market principles is that those free market principles have run right through all those false narratives.
Mhm.
Do you think that we're still a long way from really getting to the core of the fundamental exploitation issues, both financially and educationally?
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of, I look at the NIL legislation, I look at the transfer portal, they're token concessions, right?
Right.
Because if you take Neil, for example, and I try to follow, some of the athletes that have these Neil deals, and I think
Hmm.
that's an additional job, additional responsibility that they have to take on in many cases.
Right.
If they have to go out doing signings, they have to do sponsoring a product, they have to have appearances, so what is going to suffer? It's definitely not going to be athletic suffering, right? It's going to be academics in most cases. So, here we have a place, even though it sounds nice, that you can monetize your name and image and likeness, but again, you're giving them an additional job to sort of engage in. So for
Right.
me, I think, they should add an additional L, right? And compensate them for their labor in some
Right.
forms. And there have been many others who have talked about, compensating them for their labor in some form or fashion, trust funds or what have you. But I
Mhm.
think, definitely in terms of, they've, yes, that's progress, but again, they're token concessions. And I think we need to talk more about, definitely compensating for labor, definitely in terms of, some of the other issues that exist when you
Right.
talk about medical benefits, when you talk about educational quality of an educational experience. One of the things I advocated many years ago was this idea of reducing their course load, and allow them to come back. And I think some schools allow athletes to come back and to compete, or to finish their degree cost free. I think they should, in order to get a quality educating experience. But think about it, I've taught in classes for over 20 years, and I know I've lectured to student athletes that had a big game coming up, and the last thing on their mind is what I'm talking about, right? Because,
Right. Right.
the challenges, they getting ready to go to a press conference, so that
Right.
quality education experience is very important. Medical trust, those type things that the athletes right have put in place and others have advocated for years, I think moves us a little bit further to some of the core issues.
And there are 5 bills, 3 in the Senate, 2 in the House, that would essentially eliminate the athletes' rights movement through federal preemption of state laws. States get taken out of the regulatory field, antitrust immunity. The NCAA and Power 5 wouldn't be held to account under our free competition laws. And then importantly, athletes couldn't be employees as a matter of law. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the situation of like Power 5 athletes, but particularly football and men's basketball players, in terms of having access to basic American principles of freedom of association, freedom of speech, and access to all of the legal protections that other Americans enjoy?
Yeah, yeah. It would take sacrifice in order to, obtain those, where obviously athletes, similar to in the history, where athletes that stood up for rights, stood up for
Hmm.
their beliefs were challenged, some were ostracized on campuses, some were kicked off of teams. When you think about the history of, fighting for justice, fighting for civil rights. But I think it's going to take, sort of this organization of the Black athlete, voice. Okay. I think that's the probably the best route,
Hmm.
organizing, getting a political blog, unionizing. I think, individuals like Remoga Humo is doing some phenomenal stuff.
Hmm.
But I think the thing that's going to push it quicker and further is market disruption, or work stoppage.
Yep.
That's going to get a lot of attention. And I think it'll silence, a lot of things that, I see it silencing when you talk about a lot of the DEI, cancellation of I think the Black athlete has a role in, silencing a lot of that activity or that anti-DEI types of practices. So definitely they have a, power in sort of addressing some of their needs. If they were to take that route, hopefully the organizing, right, and developing
Right.
a political bloc will give them, the voice they need or the political, power they need to address those issues
Yeah,
without
you
more
raise a
stoppage.
yes, you raise a really important theme there, and that is self-help. And that's it's such an important tool. And with our project with DYK, we're trying to take some of these complicated issues and get them where athletes live, and we really believe there's a gap there. And the athletes don't understand the power of the NCAA's lobbying campaign or the tactics they've used in federal litigation or what they've tried to do in state legislatures. And we think that until they understand these issues, it's going to be hard for them to exercise their own power. If the NCAA and Power 5 were to get a favorable bill like the ones they've been pushing since 2019, and the athletes have no legal pathways to assert their rights, their only option is self-help and withholding their labor.
Right.
And, given the power structure and the race-based component of it, I fear that if and when that comes, there's going to just be a hellstorm of pushback against those athletes, and it's going to be racialized.
Yes.
And I think it's so important to put all that stuff on the table now so that athletes can understand what they're up against.
Yes. I totally agree, and that access is extremely important. Having access to educate those athletes is extremely important. But again, there are challenges. There are challenges on my campus where I'm at now at the University of Houston, challenges, at previous institutions of gaining that access. And the most access I've had is through the classroom, is when I've been able
Wow.
to inform them. So it's better
Yeah.
than nothing,
No, it's perfect. I mean, that's
Yeah.
beautiful, right? You're using the educational process to
Right.
serve its purpose. And, ironically, a lot of the restrictions and burdens the NCAA puts on these athletes pull them away from that. But to segue into this notion of understanding and owning your power and organizing in a way that you can advance collective interest, I want to talk a little bit about your 2011 book, Sports, Race, Activism, and Social Change, the impact of Dr. Henry Edwards' scholarship and service. Could you talk a little bit about what led you to write that book and the role that Dr. Edwards has played in framing some of these social justice issues in the sports context?
Yeah. Dr. Edwards has always been a mentor or sort of a leading example. I think he's a quintessential intellectual activist. And I think, reading his work and, knowing that he was one of the architects of the revolt of the Black athlete, I think that should be required reading for all,
Yes.
athletes in general.
Yep.
But I think, the thing we notice the most is about him probably is the Black Power salute with John Carlos and Tommy Smith. But he did a lot of organizing on college campus, San Jose State, with athletes, when there were the same challenges we're facing, racism, overt racism, covert racism, to, make sure athletes were getting, trying to end the deferential treatment, forms of discrimination. So I think highlighting his work is one of the things that we tried to do, the editors and I tried to do, and, putting together other scholars that looked at how Dr. Harry Edwards inform and influence some of the things they're doing, and how they're doing it.
Yeah. So his book, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, was published in 1969. And so it was in the context of the civil rights movement. We're going to get to that in a second, the importance of that context and structural framework. Then in 2018, the book was re-released with a 50th anniversary edition. And I have my copy here, my dog-eared copy. But, on the back cover, you offer a quote as part of the 50th anniversary reawakening on these issues. And you say, a must read for all scholars, activists, athletes, and sports enthusiasts. Edwards commandingly expresses how the collective voices and unified actions of Black athletes can evoke institutional change. And I love that institutional change. And I
Right.
just wonder, you say that this should be required reading. How many Power Five athletics directors, conference commissioners, and university presidents have read that book, do you think?
Very few, if any.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that probably know Dr. Edwards. It's probably very few of it. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, that's the point,
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of use the revolt of the Black athlete as a template for talking about a comparison of these sports related issues in the context of a movement that we had in the 1960s
Mhm.
versus what we have today, where you have civil rights issues that pop up episodically and you have issues, but not movements, and how that could be an impediment to viewing these issues in 2023 as true civil rights issues.
Mhm.
And when you look back now in 2023, back on the 1960s and some of these seminal milestones that were part of a bigger movement,
Right.
how do you see the importance of that from a civil rights standpoint? And how would you compare that environment to what we have today?
Yeah. I think it's, when you think about, and let me, digress a little bit. When you think about most of the historical movements around racial justice, you think about William Patterson, for example, and you think about, um, individuals that use, sport as a platform
Mm-hmm.
to draw attention to racial injustices. And there was always a connection to broader issues, broader social issues that was taking place. So I think the 60s was, a prime example. You couldn't, disconnect what was going on in the community of, Black people from what was going on in the community or the Black lives of those individuals on college campuses. It's the same thing. They were experiencing racism. They were experiencing injustices, right, in terms of access and opportunity. So I think the same thing has to happen today. We have to connect the fight for racial justice or the fight for athletes' right to the greater fight of, not only racial justice in this country, but human rights throughout the globe. Right.
Right.
Black and brown people throughout the globe are still suffering from human rights. And I think if you look at some of the issues in terms of being equitable, we can make that argument. We can make an argument that there are also a lot of injustices that are taking place, whether it's economic exploitation, whether it's around health, whether it's around issues of concussion. Athletes are still dying, right, in these different sports, all right, suffering lifelong injuries. I think where they're not necessarily have assistance and, sort of getting the medical care they need because of the cost. I think we can make that connection. And I think that's one of the things that we have to continue to do today in terms of addressing, and making sure that there is this, connection to the broader social issues that's going on in our country and throughout the globe.
In the epilogue to the 1969 book, Dr. Edwards talks about there had been a piece of NCAA legislation that basically allowed coaches and athletics directors to take away the scholarships of athletes who engaged in what was called manifest disobedience. Okay. And it was targeted to Black activism. It passed by an overwhelming majority. There was some pushback, but very little from white stakeholders. And what I see in some of the much more sophisticated lobbying campaign, the racialized narratives, us versus them, the utilitarian argument, and the suppression of the athlete voice at the institutional level, I see some of those same values, those same values that are inconsistent with our civil rights legislation and American values. Do you think that what we see today can be tied back to some of those more obvious, anti-civil rights ways of thinking?
Yes, yes, definitely. Because again, if you, look at the sort of the main focus of the civil rights was about ending differential treatment, right?
Mm-hmm.
On discrimination and, based on religion, color, race. So I think those individuals that were against that, definitely operated in fear of losing something. I think the same thing is happening today when you think about, this idea, the fearmongers that talk about the end of the collegiate athletics. I think there is this fear that we're going to lose something and not make advancements along those lines. So I think it's important that we continue to, as we evolve and as we change, I think understand that this is evolution. I don't think, the civil rights movement made a major shift in terms of loss, obviously, positions that for individuals in my community, for example, that I grew up in, desegregation was much more of a disadvantage than an advantage. Okay, because we lost Black principals, we lost Black teachers, when we talk about desegregation. So those individuals that are preaching the fear of losing something, I think need to look at both sides of that coin.
Yeah. So, Dr. Hawkins, where did you grow up?
I'm Florida, North Florida, in a small town, Madison, Florida.
Okay. And when was a desegregation order in effect then? Did that start in your district?
But believe it or not, it was one of those Juneteenth type situations. So desegregation was already in place, but we didn't necessarily desegregate until I was in the second grade, which was in the late 60s, early 70s. So we had these, in the small town I was in, it was still segregated. Okay, until ultimately, it was, like I said, it was the second, third grade that we began to desegregate.
I think people who didn't grow up in the South don't really understand the nuances and the complexities of desegregation. And that's important. I think that's relevant today in the athletes' rights context in terms of understanding some of the complexities of the varying constituency groups. But I grew up in Durham, North Carolina. I'm guessing we're probably about the same age. There wasn't an enforceable student reassignment plan out of a federal court until 1971.
Right.
And a lot of people don't understand, even though Brown v. Board was decided in 1954, there was enormous resistance in many pockets of the South to aggressively using the legal principles that came out of Brown to actually try to change the student assignment plans. And you used that desegregation metaphor in the title of the article, the Sportico article. I don't know, was that your title or did the editorial board assign it?
It was my title. They chopped it up from there. I think my title was a little bit more provocative, but they.
So can you tell me what it was?
I don't even remember.
Oh, okay.
I don't even remember, but yeah. But they had to cut it, short. And I'm surprised they kept that term desegregation, because a lot of people talk about integration, but yeah.
Yeah. So in that sort of school desegregation model, when you look at the desegregation of college sports, do you see some of the same nuanced issues that have been co-opted in the way we talk about the civil rights movement and school desegregation through the lens of this great victory from a civil rights standpoint, but underneath that is a much more complicated reality?
Yeah, definitely. The HBCUs are a prime example, where we see this athletic drain, intellectual drain, for that matter, when you talk about desegregation of the schools, definitely desegregation of universities, so I think that is a prime example of one of the disadvantages that have taken place, where all of that Black talent that was housed at these institutions, right, is now being, sort of utilized and exploited to a certain degree at predominantly white institutions, so I definitely see that, that nurturing environment that takes place at HBCUs, where athletes were treated tremendously different, right? Uniquely different, and even today, athletes that we have interviewed at HBCUs, they speak of, the differences, those that are transferred to a predominantly white institution or vice versa. They speak of that difference at HBCU. So I see desegregation, sort of damaging the athletic capital at HBCUs and intellectual capital in general, because,
Right.
Again, Black professors also that were at HBCUs were moving to predominantly white institutions as well.
Yeah. And so in the courses that you're teaching or have taught at predominantly white institutions, you were at the University of Georgia for a
Yes.
long time.
Yes.
And now University of Houston. Do you feel like you're kind of a voice in the wilderness talking about those issues, or do you think that there's some kind of collective consensus and consensual understanding that these are important issues to talk about, PWIs?
Yeah. At University of Georgia, it was, yes, definitely anomaly, thorn in the side of a lot of not only students, but administrators, because
Right.
again, it challenged some of the things that they, some of the values they held sacred, right? Even students, a lot of students said, for the 20 years I taught at the University of Georgia, I was the first Black professor, the first Black male, they saw and sort of this position of authority and power, right?
Right.
And, obviously, again, when you talk about some of the challenges, right, of racism or the intersection of, race, gender, I think, a lot of people don't want to hear it. And a lot of people, especially a lot of my white students, they resisted it. To a certain degree here at the University of Houston, it's much more diverse. And I have great I have, it's like preaching to the choir here more so than at the University of Georgia, where, we have brown students. We have a predominantly white Latino population, and most of my classes are Latino and Asian students. And I think they understand and get the issues of damages of white supremacy throughout the globe, because
Hmm.
again, they have experienced them firsthand. So a lot easier here. Okay. But again, it's still a challenge because again, they look at, well, that was historically how racism has manifested itself. But I try to bring in a contemporary.
That's fascinating, that
Yeah.
transition.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. There was a Marist poll that came out on, whether college athletes should be paid and
Mhm.
on nil compensation and transfers. And they broke out the demographics. And when it came to the fundamental question of whether athletes should have name, image, and likeness opportunities or be outright paid through revenue sharing or perhaps employee agreement, there was a stark difference based on race. And the responses in the Hispanic community were correlated well to the African American community, who overwhelmingly supported payment to profit athletes. I think that those communities do see this as a civil rights issue. Do you see a way to talk about these issues now in 2023 that could allow athletes today to consolidate their power base with other groups, perhaps, and have a more powerful voice at the institutional level?
Yeah. I definitely think when you look at the tenets of going back to the sort of the focus of the civil rights movement to end desegregation in various forms, and I think when you look at the tenets of the athlete's right, all right, there are similar, definitely correlations, right? When you're talking about access and opportunity, you're thinking about equitable treatment in terms of, whether it's compensation. When you talk about educate quality of education, I think, athletes as well as administrators have to understand that there is a connection there because, obviously there are a lot of universities have DEI offices now, and that's a charge, for athletic to have these DEI officers,
Yeah.
informing student athletes. But I think, drawing similarities between, these are some things where there are injustices, right? You talk about medical benefits, you talk
Hmm.
about quality educational experience. And these are some things in terms of how they connect to the greater civil rights legislation. And I
Yeah.
think we have to continue to have, sort of that type of conversation or dialogue.
So you used the higher education buzz acronym DEI. A lot of our viewers probably don't, or listeners don't probably don't know what that is. Could you
Yes.
explain what that is and the importance of that in this model of broader institutional equity and higher education?
Yeah, yes. Some, use the term DEI as a diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some use the term JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And some institutions have that. But again, I think they should be aware of how that's under attack today, right?
Right.
When you talk about there are several states that have legislated against universities
Yes, right.
having, DEI, using diversity, equity, inclusion as a form to hire or to teach in some cases, definitely in a scholastic level. However, so again, I think that is one of the, sort of challenges that we have to overcome. Where those states and schools that still have the DEI office or DEI officer, they're challenged then with, so not only maintaining their presence there, but also informing and educating the entire university if it's at the university level. But athletic departments have hired some athletic departments, obviously, in the Big Ten, you see the DEI office, some in the SEC. I think they are responsible in informing students and informing the administrators, coaches, as well as athletic directors about some of the issues or challenges they're facing and how we can move to a much more equitable and a welcoming environment. Because that's, I think, is a much profitable in terms of where we're moving to, right? Not only regionally, but nationally and globally as an organization. I think that's what the NCAA wants to be. It wants to be more profitable, right? And I think they have to understand that in order to profit, you need to at least address some of the human right issues that have been neglected,
Right.
right? So that people are, being successful in sort of matriculating through these institutions in a more equitable fashion.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point about the role of the DEI offices and officers. They're still controlled by the institution. They get their paycheck from the institution. Do you think there's any tension in terms of using that pathway to get these issues on a table in a way that's true to the experience that profit football and men's basketball players have? Or do you think there's a tendency to try to err on the side of institutional interests? And then the institution can say, we have this structure,
Right.
have this available, and we're doing everything we possibly can. And do you see that as a problem at the institutional advocacy level?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think and it's going to take, sacrifice and a provocative leader to,
Right,
say you hired me to do this, right? And
right,
this is what this is how I'm going to go about doing it. But again, it's a challenge, again, because you're within the limits or the confines of that athletic department.
right.
Right. Obviously, they sign your check, the university sign your check. So, there's only so much you're going to be willing to do. But again, they do have the responsibility, if not necessarily the sort of the freedom to do,
Right.
good quality diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
And I
Right.
think from the athlete standpoint, that kind of ties into this waiting for Superman syndrome. We have this institutional structure in place and they're going to take care of us. And so they don't speak up. But I think it takes some provocative commentary. And that's what
Yeah.
I love about your op-ed. I mean, it was powerful. And it takes a lot of white stakeholders to a place that make them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Hawkins, if you were teaching a course and you had African American Power Five football and men's basketball players in your class, then you were talking about the tide of the civil rights era, what they could do now. What advice would you give them? What would you be teaching them in 2023? And how would you be advising them on how to advocate for themselves?
Yeah. I taught a course at Georgia, which I was crucified every semester I taught. It was called Sport in the Black Culture, right?
Okay.
And it was this framework to look historically at the Black athlete and how sport had been used as not only a means of social mobility, but also a means of political activity, right? Political organization.
Right.
So I would sort of provide a historical context, right? And to show how athletes have, in various cases, Muhammad Ali, talk about, going back to Jesse Owen, even
Hmm.
Jack Johnson, and looking at how, these individuals were political activists,
Right.
even, with Jack Johnson, this idea of fighting for self-actualization, I think that is very important, especially during that era. So I would definitely provide this historical context, right? And I would definitely, probably labor in the 60s because a
Hmm.
lot of the political activity around, Black athletes, we're looking at Muhammad Ali, John Carlos, Tommy Smith, and others, Wyoming Tyus, those athletes that use
Hmm.
sport not only to gain social mobility, but also draw attention to social injustices and, specific ones in terms of some of the injustices they were experiencing on the Olympic team. But definitely talk about how they, also organize and the mechanisms they use to organize and to connect themselves, with the NAACP and, other organizations, some connected to with fraternities and sororities,
Hmm.
on those campuses in order to attach their celebrity status or visibility to larger social issues. So I would try to, sort of organize. And a lot of coaches now, sort of prevent athletes from, making that connection, to those
Right.
organizations, to those fraternities and sororities. But again, I think in that class, I would show how that connection is extremely important for, some of the things, some of the challenges that they're facing.
So, what was the basic profile of the students in that class?
Probably have one or two, it's generally around 40, 50 students I would have in that class, one or two Black, athletes. They would come up after class and say, hey, very, motivation, very encouraging. It's one of the classes that I think benefit them the most. But again, my student evaluations were horrific.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So, the racial demographic of the overall class outside
it's
of athletes was what, predominantly
predominantly,
white?
predominantly white. Yes. This is at the University of Georgia.
Yeah, yeah, no, I
Exactly.
understand. I think I
Yeah.
told you I went to law school at UJ and was
Oh,
and
yeah, that's
practiced
right.
there for about 5 years, and so I'm
Yeah.
familiar with the climate and culture.
Hmm.
And of course, I went from Tobacco Road basketball to SEC football. I'd never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
Power, like I think, if you haven't been in that environment, in an SEC environment, you don't understand power of that football product at every level, not just the institutional level, but at the broader state, social level, cultural level, political level, legal level,
Hmm.
and it is overwhelming. And so I'm just trying to imagine what what your classroom
Yeah,
looked
yeah.
like. I love Athens and the great people there. But on that issue, I would love to have seen those evaluations, and I would love to just to sit in on your class. Outside of the student pushback, did you get any like administrative pushback?
No, I don't think they, the major resistance came from a department chair. And when I was probably 1 or 2 years into the program, and he informed me that I needed to leave that he called it stuff that I was doing around
Stuff.
intercollegiate, because you remember now Jane Kemp, you
I
probably remember
do. I
Jane
remember
Kemp,
Jan Kemp. Yes,
so
yes.
they
I was
they
there. I
want
was in law school when that was
yeah.
going down. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So they didn't want to sort of have any, they want to create this disconnect between athletics and
Right.
academics. And definitely they didn't want a professor that was, sort of challenging some of the things that were going on academically. So
Yeah.
academically and athletically, right, with student athletes, and much more specifically with Black student athletes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember that Jan Kemp thing. And back in Athens at that time, it was sort of a litmus test. If you agreed with, Jan Kemp's lawsuit, you were an outlier. And there was sort of this climate and culture issue that influenced how people thought about that. When the UNC scandal broke, and Mary Willingham was, I think, in a similar kind of situation, kind of a whistleblower situation that I think was oversimplified. But the other thing that's interesting about the University of Georgia is that a lot of people forget that they were one of the two named plaintiffs in the Board of Regents decision. They and the University of Oklahoma Board of Regents sued the NCAA to tear down their football monopoly, and that was the most consequential legal decision in the history of college sports because it gave football its financial freedom. And UGA was really on the front edge of that. But it sounds like you kind of have a different experience at Houston.
Yes, yes, yeah. Pretty much, I like to inform students that never forget you're in a slave state. You're really in Mexico, and you really, in a city that's named after a former slave owner. So I still have to challenge students with the
Yeah.
historical context of where they are. Haven't got the same pushback, as I did at Georgia. I still do get some of those outliers that go and go off on their student evaluations.
So to that point, Dr. Hawkins, when you published this Sportico op-ed, which I think in the confines of the comfort level of the debate you talked about earlier, people want it to be comfortable, right?
Right, right.
But in the context of that environment, this is a pretty provocative op-ed. What was the response to that?
Most my some colleagues, obviously found it favorable. Former students, I haven't heard anything otherwise, which I'm not sure if that's good or bad. But yeah, I haven't got a call from upper administration say, hey, you need to tone that down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I'm hoping that's a good thing.
It's interesting, when you talk about the kind of the limits that are placed on debate through the sensibilities of predominantly white power structures, what passes for provocative is interesting to me now. And I don't view this as provocative. And I think that's another layer of challenge that the athletes have in trying to just speak their truth, because it is viewed as provocative. If your experience as a Power 5 college athlete doesn't align with how the institution wants to market and brand it, and it puts more pressure on these athletes, and I think really puts more pressure on them to not speak out.
Right.
The state of debate on college sports and athletes' rights is not very good right now, I don't think. How do you see that?
I think again that there's been illusions and delusions that exist now, smoke screens that exist to paint a picture that everything the fact that it's some conferences are multi-billion dollars. We have the SEC that's expanding with the University of Texas and Oklahoma, so it's seen as if there is progress and growth. But again, when we think about at what cost, right? When we think about the lives and the athletes, I'll never forget the many athletes that I've talked to. That one individual I wrote about, and I never forget him, who said that, by the time he's 25, going to have both hips replaced. We don't talk about those things, or the concussion issue, that how they're going to have lifelong injuries. So at what cost? So again, those stories aren't necessarily highlighted. And again, they're kept from a lot of athletes because of the glory that's surrounding their performance and the celebratory type of environment. A lot of times it leaves them numb to what really happens until they're 2 years out or 1 year out, and not in the next level at the NFL and the NBA, so yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's a great illusion that's taking place.
So this has been a great discussion. I'm trying to find the epilogue. There was a paragraph in Dr. Edwards' epilogue from 19. Oh, here it is. We'll kind of close it out with this. I want to get your thoughts on this. So at the end of the epilogue from the 1969 version, Dr. Edwards was talking about some of the tactics that were used in the late 60s to try to suppress the Black athlete voice at the institutional level. And he said in that afterward that he had been approached and you had stakeholders trying to buy him off, to silence him. And that was a tactic that a lot of the institutional interests used, not just in college sports, but across the civil rights movement to try to silence the most powerful critics. So he talks about that. And then he kind of closes it out with this. He says, these actions by the NCAA and similar responses by the AAU during the 1968 indoor and outdoor track and field seasons reinforce the contention that there exists an urgent need for Black athletes to organize a federation to protect themselves and their interests. Obviously, no one else is looking out for them. Do you think that's still true today?
Definitely still true. And again, because, when you think about the fact that they are, in terms of the athletic talent, that pool that is, undergirding, the predominantly athletic talent pool that's undergirding this multi-billion-dollar operation, and they're not being compensated equitably, and no one else is necessarily fighting for them. They're going to have to take care of themselves in terms of creating this political voice, or again, connecting to those larger bodies, political bodies, to make that argument, similar to what Northwestern did. Don't get discouraged by what Northwestern did. Find another avenue, right, to connect to, whether it's the NCAA, whether it's, like I said before, remote the work he's doing, or maybe another organization, that's fighting for.
Dr. Hawkins, this has been a wonderful discussion. I'm so happy that we were able to connect. I love your work and I appreciate your work, and I thank you for it. And I would love to stay in touch, and maybe we'll visit again.
Thanks, Richard. I greatly appreciate the opportunity, man. And I really, was more informed about our discussion, so thank you.